Hi, everyone. Hey, so welcome to today's Node.js crew talk, and I would very much like to welcome you here at Applifting today. We'll be talking about Node.js. So if you be so kind to visit this Slido to tell us about your level, so the people giving the talks will be able to a bit adjust the level. That'd be great. And we'll be starting in a few minutes. There will be 3 talks today. First of them will be Petr from Applifting, who's our tech lead, and he'll be talking about Prisma, whether it's a good thing to work with it in JavaScript. Then we will have a talk by Prokop Simek from DX Heroes, who'll be talking about the developer experience, which is presumably a good thing. And the last but not least is Jan Vlnas from Superface, who'll be talking about the open source solution Superface for, let's say, one API for any use case. So without further ado, Peter, it's your stage.
Okay, hi. Který? Tenhle? Jasně. Right.
If you'll have any questions, wait until the talk ends, and then we will have a Q&A session.
To asi není ono, ne? Never mind.
We'll need another 3 minutes for technical break, so stay tuned. By the way, there are some refreshments in the back. I think there's some bit of a food, and in the fridge there is quite a lot of beer, so you are more than welcome to have some while guys are solving the technical issues. By the way, if you'll have a beer, there are cups there, plastic cups, and on them there's a QR code which has a meme there, so stay tuned. Jokes are great, right? Especially about programming. I wonder, like, what's the best joke about Node.js? Does anyone know any jokes about Node.js? No? Well, first of all, sometimes I'll talk about it like a Nope.js, but yeah, that goes with it. The really interesting thing is that basically any word in the English language, if you write it in the Google and add .js, you'll find the library. And I mean, like, pretty long words work this way. It's amazing. Like, give it a go, and one of the best ways how to kill productivity in a company for a while is to let people find the longest word, .js, they can find as a library. Seems guys are still working on it. There'll be a 10-minute break between the talks. Yeah. Peter, stage is yours.
Okay, so hi, I'm Peter. I'm a Node.js tech lead here in Applifting, as Philip already said, which means that I'm sort of taking care of all the people who do Node.js in Applifting currently. I mentor them, I organize some events for them. I help the business people with estimations and stuff like that. And what I've prepared for today is a presentation that I already prepared internally for Applisters, because a lot of people recently are considering using Prisma on their production projects. And first, let me ask you, does anyone here have any experience with Prisma? Okay, like 4 people, it's good. So I'm going to talk about that, especially in context of other ORMs, and I will want to sort of compare Prisma to others and sort of like summarize its pros and cons, because we recently used it on one of our production projects, like the first people in the company, and so we have some insights now. And like first I want to go through some overviews of ORMs, then introduce Prisma, then go through the good parts, bad parts, and some conclusion, and I will also want to do like a very little live coding session to highlight the best features of it. Now first just some like basics. For those who might not know what is an ORM, it stands for Object Relational Mapping, and it's usually a library which you import in your project if you want to abstract writing pure SQL queries or other queries for the database systems you have, so it theoretically saves your time. Now, I just wanted to have like some nice timelines and charts here, so I tried to do some research on when was which ORM for Node.js released and how popular they are. And I found out it's kind of hard to find the exact dates, but around 2014, Sqlize sort of came to be as the first major Node.js ORM. Then in 2016, Type ORM was invented, which was built on TypeScript from the ground up, as opposed to Sqlize, and fixes a lot of its issues. Then around 2017, Prisma version 1 came up, and that wasn't actually an ORM, that was more like another piece of architectural infrastructure of your project that provided some API on top of your database, which was an interesting concept, but in the end they decided to anyways go with the standard ORM approach with Prisma version 2. And I just wanted to have like some overview of how popular these are, so I just downloaded like a chart of the downloads from NPM, which might be a bit misleading because the older one might always have like more downloads, but still you can see that Sqlize, the orange one, is still at the top, but it's like the close runner-up is Type ORM currently, with Prisma started gaining traction in 2021 when the Prisma version 2 was released. And since I think it's better to give you some idea of what each of those ORMs are and what's the differences by actually looking at the code, I prepared some brief looks with code examples of how you do the same things in each of those ORMs. Now first take a look at the oldest one, which is Sqlize. And in Sqlize, you define schema, the database schema, like this, by calling an init method and passing a JSON object into it, which then creates the database table for you automatically, which has a few issues. Like it's nice, it works, but if you want to use TypeScript, you would actually have to extend the user class with the things you actually call in init, so you sort of write double code then, which then looks like this. But there's also a library called Sqlize TypeScript that's actually recommended to use in the official docs by Sqlize. But if you use that, then maybe you're going to be better off with simply using Type ORM, which looks basically the same. And how you read and create data in Sqlize, that looks like this. You just take the class representing the table and call the create methods, findAll methods, and other methods that are available in the APIs. And that's like a pretty standard stuff. Now with Sqlize TypeScript, you can also use a more active record-like approach where you create a new instance of the class and then you just save it, which is maybe a bit nicer for you. And transactions in Sqlize. And transactions is, of course, when you want to call multiple database queries and ensure that all of them pass or none of them pass, typically like when you want to transfer money between accounts of your clients. In Sqlize, you use them like this. You call the transaction method on the Sqlize object, and then everything you actually run is run in the transaction when you call the commit method on the transaction object, or you can roll back if something goes wrong. Now migrations, the thing that you always need in databases when you make any changes in the schema or in the data. are used like this in Sqlize. You can generate sort of skeleton file with up and down methods, and you have to write the migration manually, which is, as far as I know, which isn't really very nice because the other ORMs can actually generate it for you automatically. And also it has the up and down method where the idea is that you write both of them, and with the down method you can roll back the transaction. But I've never actually used it in any of the ORMs, and I think it's a bit useless because sometimes it's impossible to actually write it if you make some irreversible change. So I think you're better off simply creating database backup every time you write migration. If you want to roll back, just restore the database from the previous state and then write another migration to fix it. Now let's take a look at type ORM, which, as I said already, is sort of an ORM that is supposed to fix the issues that Sqlize has, especially in combination with TypeScript. And in type ORM, you define the database tables in this way, which looks very similar to the Sqlize with Sqlize TypeScript library. You use TypeScript decorators, and I think that actually looks a bit nicer. You can add a lot of other options for the columns, like their types. You also define relations this way. And inserting data, that again looks very similar to the way you do it with the Sqlize TypeScript library, except here you don't call like the save method on the class itself, but on like some manager that provides it. And reading data is also actually very similar for most of these ORMs, so there's probably not much reason to go through it too much. And transactions are slightly different from Sqlize in the sense that in type ORM, you call the transaction as a function, it's like some sort of callback function, which gives you a transactional entity manager, and each of the operations you want to run during the transaction, you have to run on the transactional entity manager object. And migrations are very similar to the Sqlize way, except it's created like a class. It also has up and down method, but the main difference is that it actually generates the migration for you automatically based on the changes, based on the state of your code and difference to the state of your database. So that saves a lot of time, and then you can just check if it actually does what you want and eventually fix it. Now let's finally take a look at Prisma. Now Prisma is very different in the way you define schema, because in Prisma you don't actually define the schema in JavaScript or TypeScript. You do it with using the Prisma schema file, and you write the whole shape of the database in it. And the way you use it then, like it actually looks a bit like a GraphQL file, GraphQL schema definition file. And the way you use it then is you first write this, then you run the Prisma generate command in your command line, and that will generate a client library in your Node modules folder. So it sort of looks like it's like a third-party module, but it's not. It comes from your code base, and then you install it and use it however you want, which is nice for a few reasons. I think one is that it sort of prevents you from writing some business logic in the classes that represent the database schema, which is a bit of an anti-pattern in my opinion. And this is how Prisma querying looks like. It's also like a very basic stuff, very similar to the other ones, but I want to show like the best features of Prisma, especially when you use it with TypeScript. And for that reason, I created like a little app. I'm gonna show you. It's like a little Pokédex app where you have a list of Pokemon, and I just want to add the option to add nodes to each of them, which will come here to the to-do part. And for that, I will go to the code that I already have here. This is my Prisma schema file. I already created the nodes for it. It originally only had the Pokemon one. I created the migrations to it, which I can show you what it looks like. It's just an SQL file which creates the migration for you, which is created for you automatically when you run Prisma Prisma migrate dev command in the CLI. And what I want to add, I already have most of the functionality here, but I have the option to like create, update, delete the node, and list all the Pokemon. But I want to add the option, for example, to include the nodes with the Pokemon, because I'm only asking for the Pokemon without their nodes assigned. And I will do it simply like this. And now the cool thing about Prisma is that it automatically changes the return type of this function based on what you actually write in the parameters. So now you know that this thing actually includes the nodes, it's Pokemon and nodes. And if I change it, for example, in a way that I will decide I only want the name of the Pokemon, and also include the, no, that's not it. Also include the nodes, then it will still work and it will simply change the type in real time, which as far as I know, no other ORM does, so that actually saves a lot of time for you. And as you can see, it tells me that there is something wrong with it because this doesn't match the return type of the function, so I'll just roll it back. And yeah, here I have the now just uncommented the already implemented like nodes button, and now I can add any node that I want to this. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, there's maybe a little bug. No, doesn't matter. And okay. Now, if I want to check if there's anything wrong with it, like now I see that something doesn't work. The cool thing about Prisma is that it bundles a little ID or like UI for checking the database schema, the state of the database. And as you can see here, I have the Pokemon table, which is already pre-populated with all the Pokemon and the nodes. And if I want to, for example, change the content, I can rewrite this, save the change, and it will work. So that's like a nice thing about it. Let's go back. And right. Now, one thing I didn't show you is how the transactions work in Prisma. And the way they work is they originally were a bit opinionated, like Prisma didn't actually offer the same like interactivity or like freedom when writing the transactions like Sqlize and TypeORM does, because it either ran the migrations automatically for some nested writes, which is this, for example, when you create users with their posts that automatically ran in transactions, and or there was a way how you could pass an array of Prisma commands that should either all pass or none of them should pass. And both of these approaches aren't ideal, in my opinion, because you don't really have the freedom to run any other code between the database calls, which sometimes you might want to add some additional checks. But they added the same like way to run transactions as TypeORM has recently, but it's, as far as I know, it's still just a preview feature that you have to manually enable in the schema. So it's maybe not really production ready yet, which is a bit of a shame, but it will be there. And okay, let's now go through the good parts of Prisma. I think the good parts are definitely the schema file. I like the way you work with it, how you generate the client. I like the type checking of the client that automatically changes the type of the return function based on what you write in the arguments of the filtering method or whatever. It has nested queries and filtering by relations and a lot of filtering functionality that makes life easier for you, but that would be like a very long speech if I wanted to go through that, but if you're interested, definitely check the docs. It also offers introspection, which is a way that you can generate the Prisma schema file from existing database, and the built-in Prisma Studio for administration is also like a really nice ease of life feature. Now there are some bad parts. Like you might have noticed that the migrations that were generated in Prisma were pure SQL as opposed to Sqlize and TypeORM. And I had some experience on some projects where we ran into a point where we realized that we have to make like a really complex migration, including migrations of data. And I actually have no idea how would I write that in just pure SQL. It would take me a long time. But we had type ORM, luckily, on that project, so it actually was pretty easy because you simply write all the data manipulation in TypeScript if you want to, and then just save it using some simple SQL queries. Then the second bad part, I'm not actually sure if that's still relevant, but I know some people had issues with running the migrations in serverless environments because you cannot really run them programmatically, only with the CLI, like you can run them from the code, from within the code. Also, Prisma is, as I said, a bit opinionated on transactions, but it added the like the same way to run transactions like in type ORM in the preview feature, which means it will probably be there by default very soon. And also another bad part is that thanks to you using the schema file instead of TypeScript classes, you cannot really add any typing for your JSON columns if you use them. Like in type ORM, it's actually pretty easy because the class will already have the type of some object type for the field that is supposed to have some column that is supposed to be like in JSON. And in Prisma, since it doesn't offer you any way how to write the shape of JSON that should be allowed in it, this simply doesn't work. You always have to retype if you want to use that. And there's a few more bad parts, or like, I don't want to call it bad parts, more like parts that you should be like aware of if you're trying to use Prisma. Is that relations are not supported with bulk operations. So that means that if you want to write the nested queries, for example, creating a lot of users and including a lot of their relations, then you still have to cycle through them, unfortunately. Also, that Prisma developers, in my opinion, seems a bit opinionated at times. I have like seen some discussions with them, also discussed with them the issue with the migrations, and they actually admitted in the end that it's a bit of a problem and that they didn't really think the way you have to manipulate data through, but it's still not apparently a very high priority for them to fix that. Also that you cannot split the Prisma schema into multiple parts, which might be an issue for really big projects. And I also think that it might be a bit harder to build some custom queries than in, say, type ORM, because Prisma is really made to like make the things you usually do while you develop apps easy for you. Like it's basically predefined, everything in it, including pagination, stuff like that. Definitely check the docs if you're interested in it. While type ORM, for example, offers you a query builder functionality with which you can build some complex queries if you want to, that does some custom stuff. But you can still run raw SQL queries in Prisma if you decide to. And my conclusion is that like Prisma is, in my opinion, amazing for fast prototyping. It has great TypeScript features. The migrations are a bit underwhelming for me because it's still missing some features. But I think it could be like a go-to ORM for Node.js apps soon. If they fix some issues, then I definitely had like the best developer experience using Prisma on the production project so far. But my one point I want to make at the end, that ideally you should anyway strive to write apps in a way that switching, like if you wanted to try Prisma or type ORM or whatever, you should write your app in a way that switching that later shouldn't be like too hard. Like you shouldn't actually wire your application architecture to your ORM. And that's all. So if anyone has any questions.
Maybe I have a question, like when you were working with Prisma, you said you were working with it like for the first time in the app, right? In the production application. I wanted to ask you if you had any issues or if you encountered any problems with, like if you had like N+ problem, do you know about it? Did you encounter it? And how did you tackle it, Actually,
I don't think we had any problems with N+1 or anything like really serious. The only problem that we encountered with Prisma was when we, like sometimes it gives you some error and you're actually not sure what exactly you're doing wrong, especially if you write some like complex query to the database. But for the N+1 problems, we usually, anyways, the way we write apps, we usually have GraphQL APIs and we use data loaders to handle that. So this is something we don't really use the ORM to tackle. So I can't really answer that very well, unfortunately.
And you were not using GraphQL in that app?
We were. I
You
mean,
were.
that's like, if we wanted to tackle the N+1 problem, we usually use the GraphQL data loaders, which kind of solve it in a bit different way. Like for that, you don't really have to use any like built-in ORM functionality.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
But like if it's about the, like I don't think it ever like made any too like difficult queries that would have that N+1 problem. Even when we used it for like some nested queries, like we never ran into any performance problem so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Any more questions? Anyone? Right.
Thank you. Finally, you mentioned that you should not rely too much like on the ORM and then you should keep your architecture clean. And last time I used Prisma, it seemed very opinionated regarding like the setup of the project and like demanded like to have the schema in the root level, and maybe it implies maybe having too much like dependencies on the generated types. Is there something that you would probably, that maybe it pushed you too much in this way in maybe forcing too much into your project, having it too difficult to decouple from your clean like architecture and types, if it makes sense?
Yeah, actually not really, because the way we do it is we usually have like the service layers with some business logic, the presentation layers like GraphQL controllers, and then the database layers where we write our own repos, and then we like import Prisma or whatever we have into those repos, but on the outside they're actually written like interfaces. So if we decided to switch Prisma with anything else, we could, like basically we could also decide to simply use a file system if we wanted to. And that I think is actually one of the recommended ways to write the apps. So like you shouldn't really, like I often see some like examples where you have some like controllers or route handlers that import Prisma basically, and you get the Prisma types as a response in your API, and I think that's completely wrong. Like you should have it in the like layer so far away from the controllers and service layers that it doesn't really matter what's there on the background. And I didn't feel like it pushed me into anything if I do it like this. Like of course you had to have the schema in the root folder, but that is like a detail for me. Like it doesn't really, it just sits there, it doesn't do anything, right?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Any more questions? I don't see anything on the stream, so
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, who is your favorite Pokemon?
My favorite Pokemon, probably Charizard, because I always try to pick Charmander in the first gen games.
Okay, awesome. That's what I was going to say too. Thank you.
Can I have a question? Like, what kind of operations do you recommend to use transactions with? Because it's something that I never use. Maybe.
What do you mean by operations? Like the way you use them, or?
Like actions, like something you do with the database.
You mean like a use case when you would want to use transactions?
Yeah.
As I said, one of them is definitely whenever you like work with money or some transfers of some stuff, you want to ensure that if you like deduct some money, for example, from one user, you would want to like increase the balance for the other user, you don't want something to happen in between, right? You want that to always like pass in this way. Although at that point, I would also be asking if you're not better off with using event sourcing where you don't have these like data in the database itself, but you just store events of what happened instead. Like you don't save the state of the database, but the events that happened, and then you create the state of the database from it. But that's like a whole different topic for this. Does that like answer your question?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
And then I have a question. Maybe it's not directly related to the type ORM or Sqlize, but as these these frameworks use TypeScript decorators as it is an option.
Right.
How would you recommend to keep the definitions in those decorators for these schemas in sync with the definition of the entity class? It's a lot of times a problem when you, define some attribute as a nullable, but somehow somebody forget to define it in an entity property.
Oh, you mean like if you have like an optional column in the TypeScript class, but the column for the type ORM is not optional, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a bit of a joke, but I would tell you to use Prisma, where that cannot happen to you because it's generated in the from the schema. So there you don't have like two things, which is actually like a really good pro of it. And I don't know actually how would I like solve it except for doing like thorough code reviews and writing tests.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Anyone? Right.
I might be wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, Prisma offers like different adapters to different databases. So I'd like to ask, what database did you use it with, and did you struggle with something that was limited by the abstraction, and you couldn't do really the thing with the database that you wanted, something like specific to the database?
Look, no, we use it with Postgres, but it's true that one of the things I noticed that this like Pokédex application was written with SQLite, and I was surprised that if I wanted to use one feature, and I added it in the Prisma schema file, it told me that this feature is not supported for SQLite, which I would expect to be like abstracted away, and I wouldn't have to care about it. Like I would expect the Prisma schema to be like completely database agnostic, which seemed a bit weird to me, if that's like where you're heading.
I was thinking maybe, I don't know, if you worked with Postgres, for example, if you wanted to model some like PostGIS data or some extension that's specific to Postgres, can you even define it in the Prisma schema? And if so, how do you do it? Or
I actually don't really know. Like we never had that requirement, so we didn't really try even. But I think like the fact that I tried to use some like basic feature and it told me that look, this is not supported in SQLite, I think it would be a problem with Prisma.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay.
Thanks. Any more questions? In that case, thanks
There's
again.
one question.
Oh, sorry. There.
I have just one question about data types supported in Postgres. How good Prisma deals with all the data types, like the array fields and all the new stuff which came with the Postgres 14.
Postgres what?
Postgres 14.
Right, I actually don't really know. I just, like as I said, I was a bit like surprised it didn't offer any way to shape the JSON field, but that's not really related to Postgres. But I'm not sure if Prisma is actually the best one if you want to use some of these like newer types, because I think it ultimately tries to abstract all this stuff from that, and it looks at it more from like the application level. So the Prisma schema is not the database schema, right? It's more like the things you get when you import the Prisma client, and it just tries to translate it to the database level. And I'm not sure if it actually has like any way how to specifically tell Prisma like, look, I want to use this field for this column. I think it does, but I can't really answer about the like support for all these like new features. Right.
Okay, more questions? Anyone? I still don't see anything on the stream, so if no more questions, then thank you very much again for the wonderful presentation. Seems like Prisma is the hot topic for you all, which it is for me right now as well. The last thing I used was the, sorry, what was the first one? The
Sqlize?
Sqlize, yeah, that one I used a few years ago. So thanks, Peter. And we'll be having a 5-minute break. And after the break, Prokop Simek from Applifting will, from DX Heroes, will talk about the developer experience. So enjoy beer, enjoy something to eat. I believe there is a quiz at that QR code or right there. And if you go through the quiz successfully, there are, I believe, some hats and other merch. So take it away. Okay, if you'll take your seats, Prokop is ready to give you the talk about developer experience. So please take your seats, calm down a little bit, and let's make an atmosphere for my friend Prokop. Prokop, come to the stage.
Hello, 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 hello. Thank you.
Sorry, just one more thing. If you're watching on the stream, your questions are more than welcome either on the Slido, you can see on the board right now, or you can write a message to the platform we are using, the Zoom. So, thanks.
So, hello, my name is Prokop Simek, and I'm a CEO of a company called DX0s. And I started programming 12 years ago. 7 years ago, I started at Applifting as a Ruby on Rails developer. Then I learned Node.js, and now 3 years ago, I co-founded the company DX0s, that is sister's company of Applifting. What we usually do for our clients is that we improve developer experience. What the developer experience is, what we do is that we build products that are where the user is a developer for our clients, of course, and we design the customer journey that we call developer journey through the product and improve the whole way. But I will talk more today about internal DX. That means how the development team works and what experience, know-how I expect personally from Node.js developers. We will go through one database practice, one security issue practice, I would say, and more practices and some tools. At the beginning, we will talk about database. Can you tell me what's wrong with this code? Anyone raise a hand and tell me what's wrong with this code? It's some database, there are some database calls. Okay. Yes, Lukáš?
There is no space after the four.
Thank you. There are not semicolons. Okay. Now, what's wrong with this code is that I basically queried all companies from database, and after that I iterate through all companies and query all employees of that company in a for loop. So basically, that's a problem called N+1 query that not so many developers or more junior developers know, and basically it makes a lot of select to database, and it takes a long time to query all data. And how to solve that? There is a phrase called eager loading or joins, inner joins, and other phrases. And how to solve the query? For example, this is kind of type ORM query, kind of because I don't know if the query, if the find or find all is correct. But basically, you can query all relations at once with all companies and get all employees for just one query. And if you are using GraphQL, so you can use GraphQL data loader, or there are many libraries for loading data. And data loader basically caches the data and makes some optimization about it. What about security? Last weeks, months, years, I realized that this code is not so high quality as I think. Do you know what's wrong with this code? No, I tried to TypeScript, not JavaScript, but What's wrong? Yeah?
It just exposed directly what the issue is that the email is not in the database.
Thank you. Do you know the name for that issue? Okay, thank you. Yeah, basically, that's it. The problem is that this function checks or validates if the user email is correct in database and if the password is correct. And basically, what's happening is that you send response to the front end that user wasn't found by email. But if the email is valid, so you return just a message that there is invalid password for the user. So if there would be some hacker in your form or something like that, for example, this one, so the hacker knows that the email exists and he can use it and collect all emails in his list. Yeah, it's called user enumeration, and right now we know that the email is valid, but the password is incorrect. But don't forget that it's not just about sign-up forms, but especially about forgot password forms and other forms on your website. So if you have a forgot password, this unknown email address, and after that, if the email is valid, and it will show you the message with the exact email you give to the input. So this could be also the security issue. And how to fix that? Don't return invalid email messages from your API to your front end, even from API. Don't return invalid password or password reset link has been sent to your client or from the API. Use some general messages, for example, invalid credentials. We don't know if the email of the password, and if there is a reset link form, so use some message like this. Now we will go to general practices. I will start with short types. You probably write your own Node.js app, and you probably have a team or team members that write the front-end app. And if the app is written in TypeScript, so you probably want to write your own types, response types, for example, on the backend side, and front-end team has to write their own front-end types. There could be one more module, I would say, library, with which you can share all types between front-end and also backend. So if you release new version of backend or front-end, so you always know that types module is up to date, and TypeScript will check your mistakes in the responses, basically. And even if you have GraphQL codegen on your backend, so you can use the codegen to generate TypeScript types and share with your front-end team. Practices. You probably know that you should validate your requests. You should validate your requests again. You should never trust your client, or not your client as who pays you, but the client as a front end, or even the user who uses Postman to call your API. You should always validate the input. And if you validate your request, so you might be happy that all requests are in format you want, and in case there is some example of using the Joy library to validate requests, and in case of invalid requests, you should always return HTTP status code, almost always HTTP status code 400 or 4xx. As you can see here, I'm returning the status code 400 with more information what happened to that error. And this is an example of sign up form validator, something like that. But I'm not sure if everyone in this room knows that you should always validate responses. I will tell you why. You write your own code, and of course that you have responses. Always trust yourself, but verify your code. And if you can trust your code, so you can send anything you want as a response. And how I will explain you here on this example. Again, this is the same function, almost the same, but if you have your own mistakes on your backend, so you should return 500 status codes in your API, as you can see here, and never return the error that happened in your app. Return some generic error from, for example, this one, and don't let your ORM or something like that, service API, you call any other API, don't let these messages written from your API. And why? Because imagine that there is a username and email as a response format, and you want to query, I don't know, password. Password has some secure information about the probably user, and you add the new attribute to your ORM query, but if you don't have a validation here and return the whole object, so the API will expose the secure information outside of your API, and it might be it might be a vulnerability in our code. Yeah, and as I mentioned, so the example was with Joy library, and you can also, the Joy is the most popular one. You can also use these two and validate requests and also responses in your app. So basically validate requests and also responses. I will return from one slide back because I forgot to describe the validation schema. As you can see here, so the username should be string is required, and for example, the email must be in the email format here. So this is the way how you define the validation schema, what the response body basically should look like. Tools. I don't know what's next slide. Oh, okay. Tools. You probably know OpenAPI. So sometimes it's called Swagger, but OpenAPI is more about standard, as I know, and it is basically the language you write your documentation. In these days, you can in a quite nice way generate SDKs from your OpenAPI specification. I know that there are some code gens for TypeScript that are quite high quality. I don't know what's the quality of the code for other languages, and you can find more tools on OpenAPI.tools. So basically, you can use your OpenAPI specification to generate libraries for your third-party users, developers, etc., etc. The code is not so bad. This is one example of production ready code or product. The code isn't so bad even in TypeScript. And if you will use some bad library, the code will be messy. So we can always wrap the generated code to your own wrappers libraries, where you will wrap these endpoints to some use cases, for example, and meaningful functions for developers. Another tool is, or topic is monorepo management. What's monorepo? How many of you know what the monorepo is? Okay, great. Almost half, I would say, or less than half. Monorepository. What the monorepository is, basically it's one repository where you have many packages in that one repository. So you can even have many. This is a repository of Apple server GraphQL, and you can see that in the folder packages are many packages, many modules, Node.js modules, and you need some specific tooling to manage all these tools between each other, for example, to share types, to build all libraries with the same version at once, and so on. So basically a repository with many Node.js modules. And there was a quite popular tool called Lerna, but in August 2020, the Lerna started to be unmaintained. So there was a new tool, nx.dev, that was created by that company that I don't want to pronounce. And nx.dev was a follower of Lerna, basically. But in April 2020, as there were some rumors that Lerna is dead, so it flared up the discussion again. And in May this year, 2022, Lerna got resurrected, but by the same company that is behind nx.dev. As you can see, this is a screenshot, I don't know, 1 week, 2 weeks old. As you can see, so there is a 6 days ago, probably 10 days, something like that, release and new commits. So basically, in these days, Lerna is not deprecated anymore. nx.dev was and is alternative of deprecated Lerna, but basically both are same tools as I know. If you know that they are different, so your plus, not mine, basically they are quite same. And quite controversial topic, AI. Of course, GitHub Copilot or Tab9. You can even generate your code using tools like Copilot or Tab9. And I'm not sure what do you think about generating code by AI, but I'm not sure about the security of the code. What about license rights? If we have an agreement with our client that the code should be written by us and not used by anyone else, what are license rights for this code written by AI? What about API keys? What if I write an API key? Is the API key shared with someone else or isn't? By the way, API keys in some alpha version of GitHub Copilot was some leak that if you explicitly requested some API key for some service product, so Copilot returned that API key and nobody knew what the API key is and whose. And of course, the controversial topic, what's the quality of generated code? I think that it gets better. I personally started with Tab9, and then I also tried GitHub Copilot, but I'm not a programmer anymore, so I don't have opportunity to use that. But how many of you use Copilot or Tab9? Okay. Thanks. And I think that's everything. Back to for one slide. Sorry, Philip. I just wanted also to tell you that this is quite a controversial topic. I would like to learn more what's your point of view to AI-generated code in the networking session or right now in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Well, I think that if it learned on Stack Overflow, then it's basically the same quality code as we all write. So, any questions? Anyone? Right?
No.
Thank you. Hopefully, I will able to ask that question properly. I was wondering recently that if you have in your entry to the system layer, like a controller or resolver, a lot of times it accepts some entity ID, like document ID and etc. And I was wondering that I take that ID and send it further into the application logic. And in a lot of places, the application logic has to all over again, repeatedly check if that entity is present in our storage system, like a database. And what do you think is the solution to this problem? Because I was wondering if it can be done and if it's all right to do that in like a request validation step, because if you do a validation of your request, you probably validate if it's an ID, if it's a string, or if it has a certain format, like a UID for whatever. Is it okay to at the same time do the check, like for example, if that entity exists in a database, if you have access to this entity, and at the same time return it, so you don't have to, so you can have that entity like it in the entry to the system layer?
As I remember, I have to say, as I remember, so all validations of the request should be done in the controller, including validation of presence, these objects that you request by that given ID from the request, because it's the one place where you can validate if these entities requested exist or doesn't exist. Basically, you can return status code for 404 if the entity doesn't exist, and you can continue if the entity exists. Of course, that you should always check rights of the permissions of the user, but I would propose not validate it on the basically not in controllers, but as a middlewares for your secure API endpoints. But and if you want to validate later that some entity exists or not. So I think that there are more queries to the database, and you can be quite sure that the entity already exists when the code flows from the controller to your models repositories, or I don't know what's the architecture of your app, for example. So then you can query directly, and you can, from my point of view, you can directly query data and don't care if the entity exists or not, because if it doesn't exist, so there will be some type ORM or ORM error, and it means that it's your fault of the developer, and you should use some error catcher, for example, error break, sentry, something like that, to fix these errors and mistakes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions? Right. Right there. Here we go.
Source of all questions today.
Thank you very much. Thank you about the news about Learner. I'm very happy to see that it's not that anymore. And if you started a monorepo project today, would you use, I understand that you have experiences with Learner and NX. Do you have any experiences with the other alternatives? I think there's one popular by Microsoft, one the other by Vercel. Do you have any experiences with other tools? And what would you choose today if you started a monorepo project? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that my answer won't satisfy you, because the story behind Learner and NX.dev, I don't have any experience with other tools than Learner and NX.dev. But the story behind Learner, and when I realized that it's deprecated, was when I implemented it on our client's code, and after 3 months it was rewritten to NX.dev when I wasn't on that project anymore. So it was some lightning project at the beginning of this year. But yeah, basically, I don't have also experience with NX.dev personally. I just seen that. So that it was replaced, NX.dev, Learner was replaced, but NX.dev, sorry.
Okay, so today you would start with Learner, I guess.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I am not sure what are intentions of that company that manages both libraries. But I can, if I can realize that the NX.dev is their own project from the beginning, and Learner was just handover as a maintenance. So I would choose NX.dev because I would trust much more to the newest tool and their own tool that they started with.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. More questions? Yeah.
Maybe back to the monorepos, back to the previous question. Like in our company, we are experimenting also with turborepo, which is some kind of similar as NX as monorepo, which we are also using for our like products. And this turbo repo has like a little advantage over NX that it builds the applications like not sequentially, but in parallel. So like the builds are a bit faster and CI/CDs are also a bit more efficient. So turbo repo might be one of the options.
Thank you.
Thanks. More questions? Here.
I would like to ask on the security topic. I recently came across using the HTTP response code as 404 instead of 403. So I would like to. 403 is the unauthorized, but it tells you that there is a resource there, and so I would like to know your opinion if you are using the 403 or if you see it as a security risk as well.
And do you mean 403 and 404? Okay. I don't care that someone knows that there exists some endpoint, so I would also return always return 403, because if the code is correctly written and and I know that I can rely to that validation, for example, if the user is authenticated, authorized, etc. So I don't care if it's 404 or 403. It means that 404 means that I did a mistake in my API integration, for example. 403 means for me that I made a mistake in authorization. And from my point of view, it's valuable information for me that where I should look for how to fix that bug, basically.
Okay, so you don't see it as a security problem?
I don't know, I'm not a security expert. I just realized that not so many developers know about the user animation, so I placed it here. This is 7th of top 10 of WASP incidents or threats, security threats, and I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know, do you have any opinion for that?
Yeah, I think GitHub does, because if you go to a GitHub project which you are not authorized to see, it gives you 404 instead of 403.
Of course, but of course. So from this perspective, yes, because for the user with different rights for the repository, it might be better to return 404 because for this user, the repository doesn't exist, basically. Thank you. I didn't understand that.
More questions? Anyone? Right.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations on whether you should or should not expose your server like reflection or introspection for your API in production?
No, I don't have any opinion.
Okay, thank you very much.
Does anyone have any opinion on that? No? Okay. So if that's everything, then I don't see any questions on the stream. So thank you very much, Prokop, for the talk. And if you are interested in making your development experience better, stay tuned for the next talk, which will be, again, in 5 minutes. So take a break, eat something, take the quiz, and I believe there's still some beer in the back. So see you in 5 minutes. Hey everyone, the last talk is about to begin, so if you would be so kind to find your places, calm a bit down, we'll start in a second. And as we have some time, maybe it's time for another joke to calm you down a bit. So what's the objective-oriented way to become rich? Anyone? Inheritance, yeah. But why are JavaScript developers unhappy? They don't know how to express themselves? No? Okay, seems you are a bit calmed down, so Jan from Superface to talk about Superface.
Right. Thanks for the intro, Philip. And here we go. So, as Philip mentioned, I'm from Superface. I am developer advocate there. But before I will talk about what we do at Superface, by the way, we are a startup. We are collaborating really closely with Applifting and the DX Heroes, which is also part of the reason why I'm here tonight. But before I dive into Superface and how awesome it is, I will talk a bit about APIs, which is sort of our jam. It's like what we do and what we try to change and substantially improve. So let's talk about problems with APIs. And I think that's like if you do some backend development or maybe even some front-end development, that's something you can relate to. Like raise your hand if you are familiar with this error. Right. Don't be, yeah. I mean, that's pretty common, right? Like I assume that I will get an object, but I got undefined. And yeah, undefined doesn't have the property I want. So where I run usually into this error is with when I'm dealing with some APIs, like pulling some data, and like the data which I expect are not just right there. So take, for example, this like simple code, right? Like I'm just like fetching some data, getting JSON, expecting some data property. I mean, like what could go wrong here, right? As long as I get data like this, I should be just fine. Well, yeah, obviously, a lot of things can go wrong. I can like just not get the data property. I can get like error property. All right, let's fix it. Well, by the way, my application exploded in the meantime. So let's fix it. Let's check if the data property is there. If not, just raise the error. So yeah, that should be fine, right? Well, what happens then is that the reverse proxy goes down, and now I'm getting this HTML, which I'm trying to parse as JSON. Oops, well, that's really frustrating. So I can still fix it, right? I can go on and like, okay, so let's check the response. And if response is fine, check the JSON, try to parse it, otherwise just throw an error. And what happens next? I don't know, like for example, the administrator resets the proxy and I'm getting like this default page. I mean, it's response okay. So it's fine from the API's perspective, but not fine from my point of code. And at this point, I'm like, yeah, like, seriously? So, and I believe like you yourself can see like millions of options how to fix it, how to actually properly improve that code and how to deal with these integrations. But really, the bottom line here is that you can trust an API. You can trust the data you are getting. And what we usually end up with is that in our application, we put some layer of validation and mapping logic between our application, our business logic, and the APIs we integrate with. So, yeah. That's one problem. Another problem, how many API endpoints you need to integrate with? Like, yeah, ideally just one, right? Like I have like one specific need from an API, I will get an endpoint to do that. And maybe if you use GraphQL, you always have one endpoint, but then you have like different nodes and edges, you still need to study the mutations. So like even with the GraphQL, things aren't so rosy. But if you are dealing with REST APIs, you probably know or run into the fact that like, okay, I want to do this simple task, but I now like need to call like 3 different endpoints to fulfill that task. What happened to me, for example, recently, I was dealing with some hospitality API for creating room reservations in a hotel. So I want to book a double room. I have like guest details, I have dates. So ideally, I would just have like one API endpoint to call, get all the data there, and the reservation is created. So that's how it should work, right? Right? Well, obviously, this isn't always the case. In case of this API, I ended up like calling 3 different endpoints to find the free rooms, register guests separately, and then finally create my booking, and hope that in the meantime someone else doesn't snatch the room I found. So yeah, and you can like imagine maybe you know it from your expertise, from your experience. It's similar thing with there is one CRM which has similarly painful API where even like for basic tasks like upserting contact details or something like that, you need to hit different API endpoints to fulfill even those basic tasks. And yeah, the bottom line here is that like typically your use case, like what do you want from that API, isn't usually covered just by single endpoint. So in our abstraction over the API, we usually end up adding some sort of aggregation, some sort of like hiding all the different endpoints we need to hit to fulfill our task. Now, there are 3 things you can be sure of in life: that taxes and that APIs change. For example, I picked this recent case with LinkedIn. LinkedIn announced in August that they have this awesome new versioning schema which will make everything simpler, and also like awesome new endpoints for posting content to LinkedIn. And at the end of that blog post announcing these changes, there was like, yeah, and by the way, we give you like 9 months to rewrite your applications before we are deprecating all the old stuff. So good luck with that, enjoy. And you run into that. I think it's even worse sometimes with internal APIs, like there is this guy, yeah, we are deprecating this stuff in like next week. Like, I hope you don't have much stuff to do, just like rewrite everything. So maybe like you are thinking, yeah, GraphQL can save me, like I can just like put an abstraction over that, and like we don't need to deal with deprecations with GraphQL, right? Well, here's another recent example, and that's from GitHub, where they deprecated actually part of their GraphQL API for package registries. So if you were using that, they told you, yeah, don't use GraphQL for that. Use our REST API, which I think like most people considered like in a maintenance mode, like, yeah, this thing is old and no one will be expanding that. Well, oops. So beside thinking like all that web mapping, validation, aggregation stuff, really think about like putting some stable interface between that API, its implementation, and your application. And ideally, you can just like, this part can be hidden and change if you, for example, if you switch from REST API to GraphQL or maybe gRPC or maybe even SOAP, you shouldn't need to rewrite like half of your application, right? And finally, businesses also change. And maybe you noticed like in 2018, Google changed their terms of use for Google Maps API. Did you notice that? Maybe someone was integrating with that. Yeah, so if you didn't know, like Google Maps API, which was mostly free, they added like a new pricing schema, which basically meant like companies had to start paying like thousands of percents of the price which were paying before. So I think this comment from Hacker News summarizes well. I worked at a company that heavily used the Google Maps API in 2018. The 1,400% price hike really was an eye-opener. It came so suddenly and with so much magnitude. So if you just like rely on the API or the company like not changing anything, like not going anywhere, you may end up in a hard place. So what you should think about, like when you are designing that interface to isolate that API from your application, like try to design it in like sort of like provider neutral way. Like keep your naming specific to your application. Don't just take over their models, data structures, and maybe like consider that maybe like even the provider will change eventually. And if you design it well, you can even like swap those providers as much easily as like changing the configuration. That would be pretty nice, right? So to sum it up, like this is just like a few problems with APIs, and I'm pretty sure that you can think of many more from your experience. But really, like maybe like those are not like problems with APIs, but usually like APIs themselves are the problem. And how we isolate ourselves from these problems with sort of like an integration layer in our application. And I think like most of you in your projects have something like that, if you especially if you integrate with maybe like internal or external APIs. And if you don't have anything like that, try it, it's pretty neat. So yeah, this basically is an integration layer. It can be like a few modules in your application. It can be a microservice, but it's something which will take all the hits when there are some changes and keep the environment stable for your application. But the thing is, like, we are building this all the time for every project. And I think this kind of sucks. And I think it's like even really painful, like to just reinvent this stuff again and again. So enter Superface. So Superface means super interface. And one way to put it is that it's a higher level API abstraction or a framework for API integrations. And it consists of three things. We have a registry for integrations, which is to some extent optional, but it gives you some superpowers. We have, we have an open source SDK for Node.js. It's called OneSDK. And we have a domain-specific language, which we call Comlink, which powers those integrations. But really, the core idea of Superface is instead of like thinking of APIs like, yeah, GraphQL, REST API endpoints, gRPC schemas, like really think about the use cases. What do you need from those integrations? So, for example, if you want to send email, right? I don't know, like SendGrid here, so let's send a post request to their endpoint and yeah, hope they don't change it. They won't, probably. But really think about what are the inputs of this requirement. Like, I want to send an email. I want to know what's the address, what's the body, what's the subject, maybe some attachments, and really like put the implementation, like what provider, what payload, put it aside. Another case, it's with that contact upsert or update I mentioned in CRM, for example. Instead of like, yeah, I need to hit all those endpoints, let's really focus on what's the input and what's the expected outcome. So these are use cases in a nutshell. And we actually have a few ready-made use cases in our catalog. This is pretty like generic stuff like that email I have mentioned, maybe something from geolocation. We have some use cases for working with Slack and Discord, for example. And we even have, from that sent email use case I mentioned, the way it works is that like you start from the use case and then you decide what provider you want to use. So for example, you can send email with MailChimp, with Postmark or SendGrid, and the code looks all the same. So we have one SDK to import into your application, and then you just like pass all the data into that into that use case. And if you want to change the provider, let's switch to, for example, to Postmark. I will just say, okay, I want to do it with Postmark, provide my API key, and it works the same way. And so this is something which OneSDK, as I mentioned, open source library provides for you. So really it's sort of like a basis for helping you to build that integration layer. So instead of like building this yourselves, you can use OneSDK for that. And we actually have two parts for these integrations, profiles and maps. So it's sort of like different naming for the things I mentioned. So profiles provide you with that interface, this like provider neutral interface for handling those use cases, like what's the input, what's the result, what's the schema. It also takes care of like what are the required properties, so it will handle validation. And we have maps, which are literally like mapping, okay, I have these data, I want to map them to this particular API provider. And this has some neat properties. So for example, you can swap those, you can have multiple providers fulfilling the same interface. So as I showed you with email, we can do the same with, for example, with text messages. So you can use Twilio for sending messages. You can use Messenger, or maybe you can use them like both at the same time, or like 5 of them if you have them configured and you have API keys. Then you can just rotate them in the runtime. If one provider has an outage, you can just easily swap them, maybe even like automatically. And that's really one of the core things behind Superface, that the profile I mentioned, like the interface, is something it's sort of like a contract you build against while you are developing your application, but the map, the logic for that integration is something which you can resolve in the runtime. So this actually allows you to do stuff like, okay, so there is this provider who introduced like a new version of that API, take for example LinkedIn I have mentioned, and I mean they still provide like the same functionality in their API. They just like change the API version, and I need to like just rewrite my code to use those different endpoints. And I have still like the use case is still the same, but the endpoints are different. So I can just like provide a different map, but usually you would need to like test your application, redeploy it. With Superface, we are able to swap those maps in the runtime without redeployment through a registry. So you can like update all your applications without like really just by like publishing a newer version of the map. So yeah, AP versioning is solved, and we do it live. So OneSDK is a library which you import in our application, and it works with Superface registry, where it's getting those those maps, those profiles, as a sort of like runtime logic and metadata. But the interesting thing is that the communication between OneSDK and those API providers is direct. There is no proxy, no middleman for those data. So you can easily use it with like internal APIs, external providers. It's all the same. And like the Superface registry doesn't really get any of your data. Only thing you can use it for is to provide sort of like anonymized diagnostic data. And like, why would you do that? It's because like we can, like if we have one library to facilitate all the communication with like external APIs, we can build some sort of monitoring on top of that. So for example, You can register your project in the registry. Then you will see like how well the integration performs, if there are some downtimes, and like if some things go down, we can even send you an email. And this is really like just a start. This is a basis, this is some sort of infrastructure, and we can build much more stuff on top of that. And finally, since Superface, as I mentioned, is an integration framework, not all the use cases will be provided for you in the registry, especially if you want to use it with internal APIs. So yeah, you can build your own use cases. And so far, we have two ways of doing that. We can generate those use cases from OpenAPI spec, if you have one. Or you can build them with Comlink, which is the domain-specific language I have mentioned. Like think of the Star Trek or Star Wars Comlink. And it looks roughly like this. There are two parts to it. This is Comlink map. And like even if you didn't see the language before, you can you get a rough idea. Really like what the language aims to be is to be really declarative when working with those APIs. So you can see this is just like HTTP request to some API. And we process the response. We have a pattern matching down there so we can handle different responses based on the status code, content type, and even response language. And obviously, you can also use the map to hit different endpoints in a single map, in a single use case. And the other part of the Comlink is profile, which defines the interface, something which you design against. And maybe if you are familiar with GraphQL type definitions language, it looks really similar, and it's like we got some inspiration from GraphQL, so it's not an accident. So this is Comlink. And now you are maybe thinking like, yeah, why would you build like a new language for that stuff? There are a few reasons for that. One thing is that like we didn't find anything what would fulfill what we need from these integrations. And building in top of like YAML or JSON, it's not really like the best way to provide a good developer experience. But we also we are just starting with Node.js. So the idea is that you have like one registry of integrations, but one SDK for Java, for Python, for any other language. And yeah, we are heading with that. And ideally, we would be able to sort of like level up the way how we integrate APIs. So let's conclude this. I've mentioned like a few problems with APIs. One of the problems is that like you really can't trust an API, like what data you are getting. And how we try to solve that is by giving you tools how to build like a robust integration layer. Typically, your use case isn't solved by a single endpoint. And we aim to improve that by focusing on use cases, not those APIs themselves. APIs change, and we are trying to separate the integration logic into a runtime. And finally, since businesses change, we really try to give like a robust tooling for API harmonization and isolating, like giving you like a provider neutral options. So yeah, this is Superface in a nutshell. If you want to level up your API integration, check out us at superface.ai. And you can send love or hate in my direction on Twitter on this handle. So thank you. And any questions?
Hi, thankful for the amazing talk. I can see how many issues in the past 8 years that would solve, and yeah, mistakes. Anyway, any questions? I don't see any on the stream, so you are free to have a go. Anyone? Right.
Thank you. You mentioned there is no proxy when I use the SDK. And could you explain a little bit what happens when I like call the SDK? Because I don't know if the domain-specific language comes into place or if the like request is somehow embedded in the SDK. So what happens when I do the call and do send email with SendGrid?
Yeah, it's actually a question. I think it's like sort of like a confusion coming from us calling it SDK. But what basically happens is that upon first request, the SDK will fetch that map I've showed you. It doesn't fetch it in the source form. We parse it into an ASD, so it's compact and it's easier for the SDK to work with. And it will go through that map and perform all those calls locally. It will cache that map, so like further requests are coming from that map from the memory. And we are actually planning to add like persistence. So if you have, for example, multiple instances of the same service, you can share the cache of those maps in between. So really, like it's sort of like a remote control for the SDK for the execution.
Thank you very much. Can I have one more, please? Can I have one more question? Okay, thank you very much. I assume you have some support for like some JSON API or REST APIs, GraphQL. You mentioned gRPC. I'm not sure if that's supported or not.
gRPC isn't yet supported. GraphQL isn't supported directly yet, but since GraphQL is just like over HTTP transport, it shouldn't be an issue to work with GraphQL API in the Comlink map. But you went somewhere with that question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask if there are maybe some like challenges in the way in supporting like different protocols, because I don't know, WebSockets is something that comes into mind, and there are different technologies. And we just saw an example in the DSL for the like REST thing. So I just wanted to ask, like, what's your roadmap, and if you have something that you had complications implementing, or something that you expect to see soon, or something like that. Thank you.
At this point, we are focusing primarily on those JSON APIs, but really, yeah, we are getting questions also about SOAP, XML APIs, and stuff like that. I can tell, like, concretely whether we go there. It will be dependent on what our users prefer. Definitely, like, async APIs is something like the WebSockets or even stuff like webhooks and so on are a bit longer in our roadmap, but it's something we have on a radar.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the questions. Any more questions? Anyone? Great.
I saw that your domain name is on .ai first level domain. Is it somehow related to like artificial intelligence? Are you using artificial intelligence? Is it just coincidence?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Not yet, but the AI stands for autonomous integrations. So that's why it's Superface.ai.
Great questions, even better answers. Have you had a question?
Yeah, let's say we are providers of some API, and let's say there's just no other way. Do you have any tips how to discontinue an API in a nice way? I'm just asking for a friend, of course.
So the question maybe is like, do you provide like you have like a newer version of that API and you provide like the same functionality, but you want to like discontinue like older version of that API, or you are discontinuing the functionality completely?
Completely. Like I have to provide a completely new contract, and I have to get rid of the old one.
Yeah. So there are few. So obviously, if you know your API users, consumers, that's the best way. Is obviously I like to reach them, but maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's a completely anonymous public API. And in those cases, what's usually like the best practice, there is RFC standard for deprecation headers in HTTP APIs. So you can, for example, send with your response, you will provide like a few, I think it's called deprecation, not sure. You can find it in RFC. where you can provide like information, okay, this API is going deprecated, and here are more information with link and even date of the deprecation. What I also saw when the providers are deprecating APIs is that they have these like planned outages. So they will, for example, take it down for an hour or maybe even like a day. I think it's called like brownouts. Like you have blackouts, then you have like brownouts, where it's really isn't going away, but like it's like if someone is consuming your API and suddenly it goes down, it gives them like, yeah, something's happening here. Maybe we shouldn't rely on that. And so those are like two basic things, but really like the best thing, if you can contact your consumers, like bombard them with emails, like and especially if you know who those are, if you have, for example, sort of like API key. So that's what I can recommend. And even better, provide them with some alternative, like even if it's like out of your business, sometimes you can make a deal with some other provider, like, yeah, these guys have the same API, and we have this migration guide. So that's basically what I can recommend. Hopefully it answers your question or gives you some ideas.
Okay, thank you. I thought the planet outages as well, and you validated my idea. I thought it was insane. Thank you for that. I might try that.
Outages are maybe too harsh, aren't they? Like maybe I would just like before I respond, I'll just write like sleep 1000.
That's also the possibility, but in the end, like it's not much a big difference if you have like a 30-second timeout on the request, which is like the typical. Then it's the same as having an outage, right?
Right. More questions? Anyone? I'll look if we have something on stream, but I don't think so. Nope, nothing on the Slido. So if that's it, thank you very much, Jan, for the last talk. And I guess you're more than welcome to chill here. There's still plenty of beer. There's still something to eat. So thank you very much for coming today. Thanks to you right here for watching us in your homes, probably. And see you next time, I guess. You can watch our social media, and if there are any new talks, you'll possibly will see. So thanks you all, thanks to the speakers, and goodbye.
Oh, and by the way, we have stickers, so please take some. They are really decent, no branding there, and they look how glossy they are. So please take them, they are all around here.